We're live.
All right. So, welcome everybody. Today we're doing a public user feedback session around the enterprise use case for Node. And we have a little bit lighter crowd than expected. We had a few more folks expected to join us, and primarily have Ahmed Nasri, the principal architect of TELUS, with us. So it's going to be a little bit less roundtable than we normally would. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here and get my agenda up so we can all refer to the core questions here. So, in our user feedback sessions, we, when we have a bit bigger crowd, we found that we have to do a fair amount of time management and, making sure that everyone has their time. Since we're, have a fairly broad representation of folks across the foundation this morning, and Ahmed, I'll let that linger a little bit longer. I've got the agenda up, and want everyone to introduce themselves, and the questions there are: who are you? Where do you work? What do you do? And then I'm gonna split out describe the enterprise use case. So we'll come back to that. So I'm going to go ahead and go around my screen. So I'll start off. I'm Dan Shaw. I'm an independent consultant, and I run my mouth. I do this professionally, talking to folks and helping grow the market around Node.js and the web platform. So I'm going to go around my screen, and Mark, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Dan. I'm Mark Hinkle. I am the executive director of the Node.js Foundation, and I am here to make sure that everyone else can do the real work. The foundation exists just to make sure the project is supported, and that's what we do.
Thanks, Mark. Great to have you here.
Thanks.
So next is Ahmed.
Hey everybody, I'm Ahmed Nasri. I'm the principal architect at TELUS. I'm not sharing my video. I do apologize. I'm doing the handheld thing, so my hand will be shaky. So I don't want to give anybody nausea from looking at my face. I work at TELUS. We are a Canadian telecom business. With all the glories and the complications that come with the telecom industry. We are a Node.js adopters and heavy users in all of our technologies and stacks. And myself have been involved in Node.js from years ago as both user, contributor, and advocate wherever I can.
Great. Michael Dawson.
I'm Michael Dawson. I work for IBM. I'm IBM's community lead for Node.js. Active in the core project, and I'm on the technical steering committee and acting as the chair, as well as being a member of the community committee, and very interested in sort of helping to close the gap if there is one between end users and the technical project. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Tierney?
Hi there, I'm Tierney Siren. I'm a developer advocate at NodeSource, and I'm a chairperson of the community committee. At NodeSource, I kind of work with enterprise companies, focusing on Node.js, help them deploy Node well. And then as chairperson of the community committee, I kind of help do the community side of Node.js. I work on various things, including user feedback.
Right on. Mihai?
Hi, I'm Mihai Enepetrosanu. I'm a project manager acting in Portland area with PMI Institute, and currently I'm a member of user feedback and glad to help it. Thank you.
Awesome. Gary?
Hello, I'm Gary Brown Jr. I'm a member of the Node.js Foundation, where I work. I'm currently a freelancer. I work on personal projects. I help people deploy Node.js, its community around Africa for Node.js.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. All right. So, Ahmed, do you want to tee this up for us? So, telecom, I can't think of something more enterprise than a telco. Why don't we start with, the enterprise use case, and, as you're going through that, maybe touch on some of the things that are unique to the telco space.
So I think the main lesson for me in joining the telecom is seeing how deep and how far the legacy exists. Because it's easy for us in the software world to think about, refactor fast, refactor often, adopting new technologies, even transitioning a massive amount of users from one system to another or database to another. The telecom side of it, though, there's physical hardware impact on that as well. So when we talk about people signing up even on like the website and creating a new account, that has to propagate its way all the way down to provisioning physical networks and IP addresses and following the packets along the actual network for that account to be activated for your home internet to reach your home. So what that means is there's a lot of technologies, let's say, that have been around for well over 30, 40 years that we just simply cannot easily replace. So that also propagates its way all the way back up to even our software layers and our ability to integrate and our ability to change the dynamics of how our technologies and software interact with each other. So that's kind of thing, the big kind of context that's important to kind of keep in mind in any sort of telecom technology. The other thing is also the broad spectrum of quote unquote businesses that we are in as a telecom business. So typically people think of telecom business as, the ISP, the internet provider, the cellular network provider, perhaps your home TV. But interestingly, and I have a good story about this, I keep discovering different parts of the business and different business units in the company that I am shocked and surprised that we are in that business. A very simple example of TELUS, and again, TELUS is a small, medium-sized telecom in a country that is Canada, that is also, in terms of population, we're talking about 30 million, 34 million people. Versus, for example, the US of 300 plus million people. So even our size of the business is minute compared to the US telecom business. But I keep discovering different parts of what we do outside of the norm of ISP technologies and cellular networks. Like we actually offer B2B services and products that we go in and retrofit entire buildings with networks for our business customers. We have a studio part of our business. We actually do some video productions, which is interesting. We have a VC part of the company. We actually invest in other companies. We actually operate multiple brands of our telecom, not just the one brand. So we have subsidiaries and other kind of smaller brands of our telecom business that we operate as well. We are in the business of IT consulting as well and outsourcing. So actually, there's part of the business called TELUS International, and it's the kind of like the outsourced call center business as well as tech and IT support business. In fact, somebody told me from the Google team, and I haven't been able to find this internally yet, that if you actually call the GCP tech support, you're actually talking to a TELUS human at some level, which is interesting because I told them if I switch to GCP and I need support, I just talk to myself. Is that how So it's interesting. The telecom business is big and wide, and it covers a lot of things. And at the same time, for some reason, we tend to compete with everybody. So we are in competition with companies like Netflix, as it's probably painfully aware. There's the old cable business. There's also the new IPTV business. And of course, companies like Netflix have the streaming business that competes with all of that. We compete with companies like Google, even, where Google is building fiber networks and spreading internet connectivity. Even Facebook is getting into that business as well. That's in direct competition with us. And the examples just keep on going. And if you think of where the telecom business used to be, like not that far ago, just 10, 15 years ago, I remember where the telecom was the one that decided what hardware you get on your phone, what software you get on that phone that you bought from them, and you're stuck with it, right? You're coming from the world where the telecom decided what color the phone you got from them looked like, because you only had so many choices based on the telecom provider you had, to now the technology industry has been disrupted by companies like Apple reinventing the mobile world, and what's happening with Android and Google in general on the cloud technology, to the point where now this business has to be competitive in completely different and more innovative ways than ever before.
Right on.
Was that a good intro?
Yeah, that's a great intro. And I love the fact that, many times when we're talking about the technology, Node.js and the enterprise, and the technology aspects of that, we're talking, we tend to talk about scale, right? We tend to talk about just, the number of instances or something like that. But so much of the enterprise experience is really the different business units and all of that collaborating, competing together. The people part is so much harder than the scale part sometimes. But since we're talking about Node in the enterprise, what in terms of scale and in terms of usage, maybe you could help us understand how Node's used at TELUS and some sense of the scale.
So I'm part of a team within the company called TELUS Digital, and our purpose and our mission is to digitize the 100-year-old telco. That's our tagline. So given all the context that I just talked about, what we are coming to the table with is modern software practices and modern software technology, and looking at how we can modernize the entire business, both from actually all the way from user experiences down to systems and technologies and infrastructure. And somewhere in between there's obviously things like Node.js. So if you think about it from the user experience point of view, or at least customer interactions as we refer to them, talking about the web, talking about mobile, talking about application interfaces, Node.js is obviously dominating that space. So the choice is made for us in that context. It's easy enough to say that when we are building things on the web, Node and JavaScript is the platform. There is no other choice, to be honest. And B, it's clear enough that where you want to invest your hiring, you want to invest your skill set growth, you want to invest your contribution back to the open source community. It's clear enough where that happens and how that can be effective. From the systems and APIs and integration layer, it becomes even more interesting. If you think, like, again, of the context that I was talking about, like, we are also in the healthcare business. We're also in the IoT business. We're also in the home security business. And those things are quite interesting because now all of a sudden you're talking about a level of governance and security and privacy that is beyond just, building web applications and mobile applications. So if I'm talking to my peers in the home security line of work or the healthcare infrastructure that's actually provided as the applications for our healthcare professionals across Canada, then there's a whole different level of complexity involved, at least from the systems point of view. So when you look at technologies like Node.js and compare that to the traditional kind of enterprise IT world of, let's say, Java and .NET, and the kind of, depending on the kind of business you're in, the backend technologies, as they used to refer to them. Right. The challenge there is entirely, and mostly from my perspective, is in the scale of the talent, not the scale of the technology. Because let's be frank and let's be honest, programming language-wise, like the never-ending war of programming language choices, at the end of the day, you can really build anything you want with any programming language you want. The effort might be different, But the thing that makes the effort harder, or makes or breaks the bank, is the level of appetite from the tech community to actually work in these technologies, and your access to skilled humans in the space to help you scale to the level you want to scale at. So if you want to be a competitive telco business in the 21st and 22nd century and continue to be competitive with our markets and all these different things that I mentioned that we work in, we cannot just rely on the technology that was there from 20 something years ago. We have to adopt the latest and the greatest and be actually part of the change on the technology itself. So open source is key for that. And again, JavaScript and Node.js are in the heart of it. So we can't just be on proprietary systems and proprietary technologies. We have to be open source, because that's how we actually attract the right talent, and that's how we actually grow our team. So that's how we can actually scale in terms of our ability to impact the technology evolution itself. So we're in the business of digital transformation, and digital transformation starts with the humans. And if we don't have the right culture, then technology and architecture doesn't really matter. I said this on Twitter a while ago. It's like, if you can have the most beautiful architectural diagrams and the most beautiful system designs that you want, but it's like, having a beautifully architected building. If there's no humans inside it, then what's the point?
Yeah. So I saw that Tierney had a question, and it's a great moment to have questions. Though I do want to emphasize that it's a great moment to jump in and ask questions about what Ahmed set up. We are going to be going into what's working, what's not. So just make sure you give space for the agenda to continue.
Yeah. So you touched on something that a lot of the people who I've talked to in the enterprise that are using Node talk about a lot. It's like the one thing I always hear from them is, how can I hire more Node developers? So I'm curious what your kind of experience is with that, because you said, this is a space where people, developers want to be, and they are already kind of there. So I'm curious, like, I know a few people like Curtis Kemple at MLS. A lot of his process was leveling people up. So I'm curious, kind of what the approach y'all take is to that.
So it's interesting for us because the company is not in one location. It's across Canada. Our primary offices are in Toronto and Vancouver. And what I've found, again, from a hiring perspective, in Toronto, it was much easier for us to go into the marketplace and actually just talk about our technologies and the fact that we are using Node.js and we are actually building things in a modern sense. And that was massive in terms of our hiring. The moment we went out and we just did open houses and we just went to meetups and said, hey, by the way, we're a telco and we're using Node.js for everything. That alone made a massive impact. And on our pipelines for hiring just got flooded. Again, just because of the appetite that Node.js has created and the open source community being very well aware of the value that the technology brings. It wasn't the same in Vancouver, because I think that's just more about like competitive space in the West Coast, because in Vancouver you have Seattle and the Valley very nearby, and those companies in the US are more competitive that way. They just fly people out and pay them all the money they want. So that's harder. But that's nothing to do with the technologies or anything else. That's just the competitive space. Internally, we do have kind of like the mentorship setup that we try to do and growing people in. And we actually have seen massive success in our, let's call them the IT teams that have been working with Java technologies and old school technologies and kind of the ESP systems. We've seen massive success in bringing those folks over and actually have them start building things in Node.js. And we have this thing internally, we call it the digital platform. It's built entirely on Node. It's just a collection of infrastructure, API tooling, front-end components, kind of management, and CI/CD lifecycle tooling all put together. We just label it as the digital platform. We have IT teams come and actually build on the digital platform now. And their impact on delivering the work that they need to deliver and their ability to actually feel more productive at work is actually very measurable and very visible to their leadership as well, to the point where now we're talking about how do we actually spread this even more and actually get more IT teams to start moving their legacies over and refactor everything into Node, because the impact is clear. So we've seen that success happen organically, but we're also investing in kind of setting up more mentorship programs, more kind of reaching out to the community and being part of the community as well. I mean, that's always been a passion of mine. But not just for the purpose of hiring, but the purpose of contributing back, because you bring people in, you teach them about the technology, you get them to start becoming active and kind of build their skill set in it. Then the natural next step in progression is to contribute back. And I think that's one personal goal for me. And I think it's also uniquely achievable in a company our size, because I'm talking about my immediate team is, let's say, 350 technologists, but my community of practice within the business is over 3,000 people of technologists and developers. So if we can actually get those 2,000 people, 3,000 people at some point in some shape or form contribute back to the open source community, that's unique. That doesn't happen often unless you're a company the size of Google or Facebook or perhaps IBM. So this is where I want to start seeing the maturity level of the technology adoption and the usage of the language actually start making its way back into the open source community. And I think that's my measure of technical maturity for team members, of how do they actually come from being first-time Node.js users all the way to actual contributors back into Node.
That's fantastic. Michael, did you have any questions that you had on the technical end? I know there was, mostly, hey, this is a people problem at scale.
I guess I was just waiting till we get into the, what's working and what's not working, because there's lots of places we could dig in, but I think that's a good place to start in terms of, understanding where we might prioritize things on our end if there's something that we can or should be doing differently.
Right. Yeah.
I can talk forever about the people problem and the scaling the people problem, but I can talk even longer about what's working and what's not working. And I think let's just use the most recent, most immediate example. Like, we just launched Node.js 10, amazing. I can't use it yet. And the reason I can't use
You're not supposed to, though.
Well, no, I know, but I want to use it, right? So my challenge is in being like I said, I have a community of practice that's over 2,000 people, developers and people who are learning and or experts. But I can't use it in a professional sense. That's the point. To your point, Dan, it's not LTS yet. We're not there yet.
Right.
But where can I actually leverage those 2,000 humans and use the most recent version so that we can provide that feedback? What does that mechanism look like? And short of people working on side projects and doing things, for fun, there's not a mechanism for me as an enterprise to actually be more impactful there, or actually adopt something early there and provide, measurable feedback there. So it's more about there's no structure to it. We can go and do something and just ad hoc build and try things, but maybe there is something the foundation can kind of structure so that organizations such as ours or others can actually feel that they can actually do something fast and early, as opposed to just the standard mode of, oh, okay, Node.js 10 is out. Great, we'll just wait for the LTS. Let me know when you guys are ready.
Right. So did you guys start, I understand you're not going to pick it up today, say a month or a couple months before, do you start experimenting with it, or do you just wait for it to be LTS and that's really the first time you start experimenting?
As a business, I wait till LTS. Individually, I've been playing with it for a long time.
Sure.
But that's not the same thing, right? So as a business, I have no kind of, I don't know if structure is the right word. I just don't have any mechanism that I can be useful to the foundation in trying something early, right?
You don't have a feedback channel.
Exactly. I don't have a feedback channel that is structured.
Well,
so I can do that. I have the ability to go and spike activities and spike work and get 100 or so developers doing things. But what are those things? There's an infinite number of things I can do, but I don't know if they're useful or not.
I mean, a few things that come to mind would be, for example, if you have a set of regression tests and you ran those on, obviously you're not going to put it into production, but if you ran those regression tests using Node 10, that would be something that I could see be quite useful as, did it, does anything new come up? And if it does, feeding that back into the project.
Yeah, that's a good example of a structure that I can follow. So that's one item I can add to the list. So,
So I guess maybe what you're saying is it would be good for us to think through what we would hope people would did and actually document that somewhere. Is that
correct? Provide
Okay.
the framework of what you would expect people can and would do, so that people
Okay.
can go and say, if I can, like, I can. Now that you said that, I'm like, yeah, I can go run all my regression tests and all my unit tests and see what breaks.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, to add a little bit of context for those who aren't familiar with LTS and current and the usage patterns around those, right? So we have this 6-month current release, and that is generally considered for early adopters or folks that want the latest features. And eventually we take that, and that uses the active usage of current really enables us to deliver that stability and reliability when we get to the LTS release. So oftentimes the enterprise approach is you wait 3 or 4 releases after the first release to let some of the funk go out. But I like the framing, Ahmed. The framing of there's 10 0. You may not be putting it into production, but is everything working?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. We should go off and think about all the different things that could be done. I think that's actually a good discussion topic for this particular group in terms of, that's one idea I could come up with off the top of my head, but by sort of better understanding how the organizations are using it and where, we might come up with other ideas as well. So.
Right. I've never actually, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, I've never actually, thought of that as a point to engage the enterprise users. I'd always kind of assumed, current, let the startups and, more independent and aggressive teams, go and use that. But there's absolutely good, sensible practices that we can do. And we have some great examples in the past. At Voxer, we'd always we just had so much data flowing through the platform, comparatively to the other sets of users, some time ago. And when we'd run Node, the latest version of Node on the system, we'd really be able to see different behaviors than some of the other use cases that were out there. So that's brilliant.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess what I'd suggest is, why don't we take that as one of the topics for discussion in one of the follow-up meetings, in terms of like, we can all think about it, come up with a list, and then sort of get back together to sort of go through, brainstorm, and then figure out how we publicize that, sort of make it a formal ask almost from the project.
Yep. And Ahmed, if you with that sort of inspiration, think of how you could turn that into a process internally and want to create an issue to sort of help everyone else frame their approach, that would be amazing. So invited there, and we'll feed this question of what can you do back into our follow-on sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, that's a good example of like reactive type of action. So if let's say the new release comes out, there's some data you need to collect about regression or whatever, what can companies like us do to help? There's also things like discovery and kind of exploratory things that, I don't know, do you want to know how many times we call what certain internal APIs in Node? Because I can go through my code base and tell you exactly how many times we call the file system API, for example, and what we use and what we don't use. So there's some exploratory things that we can also do.
I was hitting this yesterday when I was playing with some stuff in our own products, but I'd be curious to see how many times you hit new buffer in your own code, or like the deprecations that we're shipping. Um, Before that, like you don't want to find out about that once we go LTS. Like getting that kind of information of like these are the major changes that might affect you. Uh, is there anything additional on top of what shipped in Node 10 that we can do to kind of lessen this barrier, or create a better path for you to upgrade? And like I don't think that kind of deprecation happens often. Like in my experience, it hasn't. But getting feedback on like, okay, if you just run this with your app, what, like, does it error out a bunch or does it just run fine? That kind of stuff would be super important and helpful context, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think one of the things that we want to do is engage a channel through which the TSC or the community committee or anybody in the project can say, well, I'm trying to make a decision, and I'd like to get some feedback from people who have large scale production deployments. So how do they put that question together? How does it get to the enterprises? How do we get the feedback and so forth? So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we should work together on, formalizing that so that it's easy, right? We come to make a hard decision and we say, okay, well, wait a sec, we can get more information, which always helps. Let's go ask this group over here. And that's part of the motivation, I think, of trying to get this group together and sort of make it an ongoing thing.
Yeah, and I think that making it easy for individuals like Ahmed that's going to go and spike the teams to go and do this. We have to recognize that he's potentially bringing to bear hundreds of people that are going to go and give him data, and then we need it not to be a huge burden of effort on our end. Ahmed understands well enough that we're all volunteers here, so
Right.
he'll be patient with us, but that's definitely something we'll need to keep in mind. So Gary, you had a suggestion here, and I want to make sure we give it the floor.
Sorry, before we get into that, just to give you a quick answer, I have over 1,000 repos, and I did a quick search on new buffer, and I only have about 90 results, and they're all probably easily replaceable within a day or less than a few hours. So
nice.
Not even a big deal.
Good, that's great news.
And it's great to hear that that doesn't seem burdensome to you. Like that's not a trouble. Like even your attitude in that is helpful context that I think is like that's
this is my point. Like I've seen the discussion on the new buffer debate, and look, the reality is I got a 1,000 repo that has it, but not a big deal.
Yeah, so I think having that additional viewpoint we can bring into those discussions is one of the important things we can work on here.
Yeah, and that's for you to, if you provide the structure and you provide kind of a playbook for companies to say, hey, here's some things you can do. Maybe go search your codes for the following. Tell us how many times it's used. What context is it used in? I can do that. It's easy. And then I can provide you that data. And then that helps inform, the rest of the conversation that you want to actually have.
Yeah, I think that really balances, the voices that we hear where it's one individual with 1,000 repos, and that's an incredible burden. But it's inverted there in the enterprise case where you've got the repos and then 1,000 people.
Right. Yes.
To actually go and work through those issues. And I know from experience with Ahmed is he's got everything automated and set up with CI/CD. So when you have that level of confidence in infrastructure that you can lean on, then you can make the simple code changes, and the rest of the infrastructure helps you do the rest.
The other thing is, I mean, Ahmed was talking about more proactive things. That's still a sort of responsive, we have some questions, let's go ask to get some more information, which is good. I think on the more proactive, mean, I think working together to get a better, understanding documentation, direct feedback on the key things for the enterprise. For example, we certainly have our views, working at IBM, we have our views of what's important for the enterprise, but I think as a project, we can work more closely with the companies to sort of highlight what are the current things that are the most important, and then look at where, is it that Node.js is, at 100% on those, or is it at 50%, and that there's a gap that, we should look at and look at filling. And usually those are the kind of things, they're not filled because it's going to be a longer term effort to fill those, and to say, okay, well, yes, there's a gap here. And, for the longer term success of the overall project, we need to work on something that's, bigger, longer scope, complicated, but it's important because we can, we get the feedback from the people with the large deployments to say, okay, yeah, let's go work on this particular piece. And there's so many different options that, having the direct feedback, I think, would help us narrow them to, and also maybe, test out early ideas and options as opposed to trying to make some of those up. Because I know often we come to, we're looking at things like worker support. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, do we have concrete use cases and places where we can validate that, that's actually useful, that there's going to be a benefit? So I think that's another area where sort of more proactively, if we could come as the enterprise group could come together and sort of highlight a few priorities, and then work with the project to provide the use cases and the feedback when we have, ideas and things to try out.
Yeah, like just to hit on a couple of those examples you mentioned, like, worker support. Well, I'm running everything on single instance CPUs and Docker, so not really going to get too much of a benefit on that, right? And speaking of Docker, like when security patches are made and on releases, I don't want to have to wait a full day for those security patches to show up in the Docker image. Like that's really us sitting there refreshing, waiting for the Docker Hub build to be done or the merge on the pull request to be completed, right? That's important for us because when people see security alerts go out in the community about important security patches coming, and we don't have an answer for it, that makes a lot of people, grow more gray hairs and in an enterprise setting, right?
Right.
That's actually really that we need to coordinate with the Docker working group a little bit better on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's already been a discussion on that front, but I think getting more of that feedback helps in terms of framing that, wait a sec, it's not just, it's getting the full picture on who's concerned about that versus it's only a day, maybe it's fine kind of thing, right? So, yeah. Yeah,
again, I'll give you a little bit more context, and I'm not going to hammer this point, but just again, for Michael's example, to dive deeper, like when the blog post went out that security changes are patches are coming on all major versions, and it's a big deal, and everybody needs to pay attention. Guess what? Everybody did pay attention, including VPs and security organizations within our teams, and they were all like, "Oh my God, something big is coming!" Right? So there was a level of anxiety that was generated, and then when the announcement was made, there was a full 24-hour period before we can actually get the latest Docker images, because that was what we're running on infrastructure-wise. And then, because we wanted to use the official ones, we didn't want to just roll our own. And then that still doesn't mean that our applications have all been entirely patched and upgraded. So that took us another perhaps 48 hours before everything is updated, right? So, right, it's more communications and anxiety that happens inside an organization the size of ours. That doesn't necessarily mean the burden is on you, but what can you and we work together on so we can have a better structure for those things? And we're happy to be there for it.
Yeah, there's certainly been discussion in the security working group on, a program around that. Like basically, it's people. I don't think it was necessarily geared towards end users, but it was sort of like, embedders, people who then rebuild Node, giving them some additional time. But it's kind of the same concept. And I guess so I think that's a good conversation to have this group involved in, as well as like what would help on those fronts, and at least we can sort of understand where the pain is and see what we can think of. I mean, I guess there's some, there's often some of the hard trade-offs is like, would you prefer to get it later, but have some additional notice, or, anyway, I think that's a good topic to sort of make another that could be another area of discussion to understand and drill down into.
Michael, where does the Docker working group fit these days? Is it in release? Is it in build?
It's its own group. It basically works fairly autonomously.
Right.
I think some of the some things that play into it is it's not just us in terms of getting those built. We update a set of files. Those files are then used by Docker. Once they're committed, it requires a build by the Docker infrastructure to get the new images out. So I'm not sure how frequently they do that or how often they do that. So in terms of that 1 day delay, I'm not sure, without doing more investigation, whether it's the delay of us actually creating the changes to that are required for the Docker image, or for those being picked up by Docker themselves and building the new images and making them available.
Right.
In this particular instance, I remember because I was watching the pull request. It was between making the change and then actually merging the pull request, because then the Docker hop build is automated. So as soon as that merge happened, Docker hop kicked in, and then within a few minutes it was ready.
Okay, so that is so if it's basically something like that, then yes, we may need to pull in. If we pulled in the Docker team into the release process, we might be able to close that gap a bit. So yeah, so that's valuable feedback, and I'll take that back to the next security working group meeting, and see what we can do on that front.
Yeah, and sorry to dive deeper into that Docker example, but the previous one you mentioned was more important when you said workers. Yep. Well, how important is working on workers? Well, how many of the user base is using single CPU processes on Docker images versus multi-threaded or multiple CPU processes?
Exactly. It comes down to, are there some concrete use cases where people will see real benefits, and will those benefits be better? Can you get significantly better benefits by using, a multi-threaded worker implementation versus using cluster and basically having multiple instances of node? I think. Yeah,
we've adopted that constraint because it's a reasonable one and a good one, and it matches. You get into this really sweet spot of a single compute unit in your orchestration and auto scaling, right? So that's compelling. But I wouldn't necessarily say that we want to, heavily index on, single process as a primary constraint in, evaluating the technical use case. Because
agreed.
Ahmed's pretty enlightened in terms of his understanding of the platform.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying. Yeah, I think it's just that there's a lot of different options, and again, the feedback of if there's lots of people doing it in one particular way and none in another way, that can inform what makes sense and how much maybe focus we try and put on a particular area or not.
Or just prioritization.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a few more minutes here, and I'd like to just feedback in. We've basically been going through what's working, what isn't. So Ahmed, any other probably room for one more topic to cover in what's working, what isn't in the enterprise.
To be honest, I just relied on recent examples in memory, but I'm sure if I go back and think deeper, there might be more things. So it's useful to have this kind of dialogue ongoing. And I mean, again, this is probably not news to you, but a lot of the day-to-day concerns in terms of the user land of development ends up being around libraries and NPM and those kind of things. People don't tend to think too deep about the core. But they do think about performance, so that's important. And then debugging performance and measuring performance is definitely key. And I know there's a lot of libraries that help with that, but I don't know, maybe there's something there around whatever happens at the core in terms of surfacing user-level performance measurement that people can do it. And I know the debugging tools exist. Maybe there's a little bit more improvements to be made to the APIs for these tools to surface that data a little bit better.
On the performance side, I'd be interested. Like, have you run into, specific regressions or things like that when you've moved up from one versions to the other?
Personally, yes, on different libraries and benchmarks that I ran on my personal stuff, we don't have that level of, that's what I'm saying. And I don't have that level of investment in a consistent manner across my enterprise level work with the applications and the teams, primarily because it's more taxing to create that kind of level of benchmarking across projects and work in a consistent manner. So my feedback was there is that, well, is there improvements to the debugging APIs and the benchmarking and measurement APIs to surface that data better? Because right now you have to, do a core dump, and then you have to collect that data and, maybe use some visualization tool to do a flame chart around it, right? Maybe there's some more investment from the core to make that more user-friendly for the, non-initiated or the non-advanced developer who is going to invest a lot of their time to do that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I was coming from it from the benchmarking workgroup perspective. Like, we've tried to cover some of the key use cases, but if there's some that are falling through the cracks and we're actually seeing regressions, those are ones we should prioritize. What you've just mentioned, I think, comes under the work from the diagnostic working group is working on, where people are working on different tools to help, not just the performance side, but functional investigation and stuff like that, but feedback in terms of what you're having difficulty in doing, and what would be helpful would help inform the work of that group as well.
Well, isn't there an opportunity? So the benchmarking working group, manages ostensibly the benchmarking, but it manages it internally with a suite of applications and tests that we're designing and we're running against our stuff. And my takeaway from Ahmed here is that there's an opportunity to extend that beyond our infrastructure and bring in that the data, not just the is the diagnostic working, or are we able to get the data, but where does that data go, and how do we make use of that data?
Yeah, and again, like, if you look at, and I keep looking this up every once in a while, but there's only the one, I guess it's a page under the guides on the documentation of how to profile your application in Node, and it's pretty involved, right? A developer to go in and do that. So if you're improving the tooling, then you have more of an opportunity to people to actually do that more, and then you can surface more feedback in terms of, oh yeah, this version or this patch or this change is actually impacting my code. But if I'm going to have to do this kind of profile dumping and managing and then filtering the data through every single time, then as a developer, I'm probably not going to do it. I'm not going to have the time.
Yeah, I guess we're at the point where we know we need better documentation for some of that, but it's been a challenge to find, the volunteers with enough resources to go through and build that documentation.
Ahmed, would the opportunity to capture large scale telemetry be a possibility?
Define what you mean by large and define what you mean by telemetry, just to be on the same page.
Telemetry. So you're talking about going in and running some scripts across the code base, right? The approach that you would see in Chrome Dev Tools or other infrastructure like that would be that you'd phone home and be able to transmit anonymized data to some centralized location. Is there any latitude to explore that, or is that going to be a non-starter?
It's possible. I'll have to think about it more and perhaps define more criteria. But the challenge there is also, like, how effective is that be? Because that's why I asked, what do you mean by large? Since our units of code are as small as we can make them, microservices and all that,
Right.
and rapidly changing and rapidly deployed, we deploy to production, I think like close to 500, 600 times a day across all of our teams. So how can I make that information useful without it being too noisy due to the continuous upgrades and continuous improvements and continuous deployments that happen? Again, that's one area where if you provide the guidance and provide the structure, then companies can take that and say, okay, yeah, I have a framework, I have a playbook, I have the type of information that I can provide. Here it is. It's harder for me to kind of answer that question without knowing exactly what you will want to get out of it and what the data you're looking for is in particular.
But I think Dan was asking in the context of trying to help the enterprise understand their performance. So it's almost not, I don't know, Dan, if maybe I'm mischaracterizing. It's not necessarily what we're looking for, but helping the enterprise get what they're looking for in terms of the performance analysis, right?
Yeah, having shared visibility into that context where we can all go and point to that, and if there's a data stream coming somewhere, then we could collectively go there. It just it's a very common practice in business. Trying to do that in open source and foundation is it's never seemed like the right approach. But I've always wanted to keep testing that to see if the community really wants that and needs that, and if there's the need there, then we can take and look at how to explore that.
I guess to me, what
I think I understand better what you're saying now, Dan, and I actually have a very good parallel that you can compare to. I don't know if you folks are familiar with httparchive.org.
Yep.
Internet Archive?
httparchive.org is basically a collective of mass amount of data about HTTP traffic around the world. And people use that as a resource to look up information and determine things about how the state of the web platform is. So people can go in and say, oh, I wonder how many people are using, asynchronous scripts on the web today, because that information is logged and you can actually see it. So they're actually able to derive information and data from it. And it's both kind of crawl based as well as people contribute to it. So I often see it where people go and it's like, oh, I wonder how many people are still using this CSS property and how many people are actually doing lazy loading of images, for example. What is the average, JavaScript page size or page weight per project? Like, there's interesting metrics that people are able to derive, again, because it's a public data set. Is that what you're saying, Dan?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Internet Archive and the ability to go and go to archive.org and look at old pages. I was actually unaware that there's just that data turned around.
No, it's not. It's not Internet Archive. It is specifically the domain httparchive.org. It's a completely different project.
Yeah, it's it's an Internet Archive project, like sub project.
Oh, is it? Okay, I didn't realize they were related.
But Dan, I guess to what you were describing, kind of sounded like you're describing an APM to me. Like, that's honestly what it sounded like you're describing, like as a part of Node. And I know there's things like async hooks and stuff that kind of do that for us, like enable that.
So the delta between the concept of APM and telemetry. Telemetry is specifically anonymized and takes usage and sort of strips out all the context. And APM is the opposite of that, where you're trying to thread together all of the context into a coherent view of all the bits and pieces.
Okay, and I guess I was thinking about what I was kind of crossing what you said and what Michael said about internal at a company and like being able to get that data. So yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, apologies.
No, you're fine.
Well, another idea that comes to mind just as you're talking about this, like I remember in Google Analytics nowadays, you can actually opt in to share your data anonymously with the collective so that people can actually leverage it, right? So it's part of the Google Analytics features, I guess. you could have this conversation with kind of companies, let's say like New Relic or Dynatrace or so on, of maybe that's a contribution they can have, and then they enable companies like ours to check that box and say, yep, I'm okay with sharing the anonymous data.
That's clever. Yep. That's a great way to, to not build new infrastructure and collaborate with the community. I like that idea a lot.
I'm going to be talking about that today at NodeSource, I guess.
Awesome. Well, I want to go ahead and we've come to the top of the hour, and it's been a fantastic discussion. I think we have immediately some action items, and then to this group, which is going to be on a recurring basis here in user feedback. We have some great topics to feedback into a broader discussion that came out of this. So I really want to thank you, Ahmed, for taking the time today to share that user feedback.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and I guess hopefully over the next few weeks or whatever the time scale, we can come up with the sort of deep dive next topic, right? And
yeah, I think that enabling, since we're in the 10 current, I think that's a great starting point for the discussion, where we'll talk about current, talk about test some of our assumptions around current usage and interest in current, and feed that back in and make sure that everyone's having a great experience.
Yeah, and I think around the and what can we sort of document and recommend and ask that enterprises can do, and to help validate the current, so that the LTS is as good as it possibly can be. So, because I think that's, I agree, it's a good time. So that would be I quite like that as our next topic.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for taking the time for this public user feedback around the enterprise use case. Thanks, Ahmed and Talis, for sharing all the context, and Tierney and Michael Dawson for representing ComCom and the TSC, and Mark Hinkle for joining us for the foundation perspective. Thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.